Thank you. First of all, thank you for taking time out of what I know are busy lives to come here and, gather together. And secondly, thank you everyone who has created this space. I'm beginning to feel quite envious. Writers always think that if we can find the magical place to work, everything will be fine. If we can just find the right kind of pen or the right kind of computer, right? Are there other suffering writers in this group? Aha. And a publishing house in the same place. Perhaps you could re-establish a branch in Manhattan for those of us. So thank you, and I'm well aware that the best role of an outsider is to serve as an excuse for all of you to come together and discover you didn't need me in the first place. You have all the energy and ideas and innovation and everything you need right here. But I especially appreciate being in the same room, because I think in the age of technology, we sometimes forget that something happens with all five senses when we are together. We are communal people, that all those chemicals that allow us to empathize with each other are only elicited when we are literally in each other's presence. So it's perhaps not surprising that the more high-tech there is, the more high-touch we crave. So I hope that in addition to what we say to each other today, you will look around the room and see one or two or four or five people you don't already know, introduce yourselves, say what you care about, you'll leave with a new revolutionary, subversive colleague, a new job, a new love affair. I mean, who knows what could happen here today? I've been traveling a lot, and wherever I go, the most important subject is the election. But a subtext of the election is the degree to which we have been told, and sometimes therefore come to believe, that our vote doesn't matter, that politics is dirty somehow, that change starts from the top, which is the opposite of the case. Change is like a tree. It starts from the bottom up. Hello? But in order to keep us passive, there has been a long campaign, and a very conscious campaign. One of the virtues of being extremely old, as I am, is that you remember when the Nixon folks started this campaign to say, to depress the voter turnout by saying politics is dirty, and actually the conscious use of accusatory ads was meant to encourage that feeling, and your vote doesn't count. And this happens to be the one day on Earth, voting day, the one day in which the least powerful equal the most powerful, in which we have a chance to influence the policies that influence our lives, and in which I think we have an obligation to people in other countries who are much more subject to this country and our policies than is fair, And we are in the belly of the beast, right? So we have truly an obligation. Now, that would be true any place in the country, right? So what am I doing in Florida? Okay, here's what I'm doing in Florida. In 2000, I was speaking quite by accident. It wasn't about politics. It was just a regular kind of campus speech at the morning after the election at Palm Beach County Community College. 9 o'clock in the morning, there were 706 people gathered in the auditorium. And because that's a relatively poor area, it's a relatively democratic area, right? And so people began to stand up and talk about what had happened to them at the polls. Somebody said, I went and there were cop cars surrounding my polling place, and I couldn't actually get there, and then I had to go to work. And somebody else said, oh, that happened to me too. Then an older woman said that the bus from her retirement home had gone to the wrong polling place, and then they never got to the right one. Then several people talked about the ballot and how they had just seen a representation of the ballot on the way out, the famous butterfly ballot, right? And realized that they had voted for a candidate they did not think that was not their chosen candidate. And gradually, people stood up, and other people were educated by what they said because the same thing had happened to them. And in the end, more than 100 people out of 706 people who were accidentally in that auditorium had either been unable to vote at all or unable to vote for the candidate of their choice. I took their names and their precincts. I gave the list to the election lawyers. I mean, you know, I tried to be part of the network that would let this be known. But I have never forgotten that there was one man who was a military veteran who got up in the middle of the crowd and said that he had a 10-year-old daughter, and for her sake, would I stay and help them demonstrate against the illegality of this election. I had other things to do. I mean, I couldn't, you know, I didn't do it. And I have always regretted that. To this day, I regret that. I don't have fantasies, you know, that it could have made a difference, but I think we have to, maybe it would, you know, we have to behave as if everything we do matters, because we don't know which thing that we do will matter. I mean, I have, you know, spent weeks preparing congressional testimony. It had no impact whatsoever. And then somebody came up to me to say, you know, that something that I had accidentally said and didn't remember made a difference. We don't know. So it's absolutely crucial, I think, that we behave as if everything we do matters. And I didn't in that case. Now, it happens also that I've been campaigning long enough so that I had an especially dramatic example of the difference that could be made by just a few thousand votes. I had, in the 1980s, campaigned for a candidate named Harriet Woods, which some of you here you might remember. She was a homemaker, an author, a radio personality, you know, just a sort of up from the ground up kind of activist who was running for the U.S. Senate against John Danforth. John Danforth had been a former priest. He was Attorney General of Missouri. He was heir to the entire Ralston-Purina fortune. It was like she was running against the entire patriarchy. But she was winning. And even though she was a pro-choice, I mean, she supported reproductive freedom, and the mythology about Missouri is that it isn't a pro-choice state, she was winning. And then at the last minute, in a way we are seeing again and again now, tons of money came rolling in, tons of money with all kinds of television ads distorting her positions and her record. She lost by, I think, less than 2,000 votes. I mean, it was way less than 1%. Actually, the fact that it was so much about late money was the cause for the establishment of Emily's List. You know, early money is like least, Emily's List, which you have your version of here, Ruth's List, great organization, right? So it was a very decisive moment. And Danforth, when he went to Washington, took with him a young lawyer from Monsanto, the chemical company, named Clarence Thomas. Okay. So there he was, present, you know, for the various Bushes, and there, you know, as that valuable thing, a person from an underrepresented group who is willing to go against the majority wishes of the underrepresented group. I mean, think Sarah Palin. It's the same phenomenon, right? So, he was there and visible to be appointed to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, to head it, where he changed the procedures so there was no more class action, so there, you know, and my favorite thing is that he made the entire staff of the EEOC read the Fountainhead. But you can't make this up, right? All right. Then he was appointed to the D.C. Court of Appeals, and there he was, ready to take the place of the great civil rights champion Thurgood Marshall. And he would not have been present or in view, or, you know, if it had not been for the victory of John Danforth. So, you know, and that was just a few thousand votes. Now, if Clarence Thomas hadn't been there to cast the single deciding vote on failing to recount the votes in this state, just, you know, between 500 and 600 votes was all that Bush won by. But in fact, the subsequent commissioned groups of all the media organizations discovered that Gore, if by any standard of counting, Gore did win the popular vote in this state, in fact. You know, if he hadn't been there to cast that deciding vote, arguably there would have been a recount under some standard. And if there had been a recount and Gore had become president, think of the difference it would have made for all the social justice movements, for the environmental movement. You know, I have a, wait, let's see if I can. I tried to make a little list of everything that would have been different, just to show you. I've never tried to read at a speech off an iPhone before, so you'll have to bear with me here. Okay, it's sort of like those few thousand, really less than 2,000 votes in Missouri, right? Think of that. Okay, that's the nail that without which the shoe was lost, without the shoe, the horse, without the horse, the battle. Remember that parable? Okay. Then Bush couldn't have caused the biggest transfer of wealth from public to private hands in the history of this nation, because that's what happened with using private firms to fight wars, to, you know, I mean, and much more than that. Or yet another optional war in Iraq, or high-level disbelief in global warming, or public schools with abstinence-only education enforced by federal funding that helped create the highest unwanted pregnancy rate in the developed world, which is what we now have, or an executive order giving billions in tax dollars to faith-based centers of right-wing political power. And incidentally, we still don't know how many millions. Nobody's ever accounted for them. Or the global gag rule that deprived poor countries of U.S. foreign aid if they offered abortion or even abortion referrals with their own money. Or corporate profiteering on privatized wars abroad, as well as privatized prisons at home. The prison industrial complex took a huge leap forward under Bush because that's what he had done in Texas and that's what he encouraged elsewhere. Prisons are corporate profit centers. Or a higher percentage of the U.S. population in prison than in any other country in the world. It's a great shame, a huge shame. South Africa under apartheid used to beat us, but now that South Africa has shed apartheid, we are the worst. We are the worst. Or corporate CEOs whose salaries rose from 30 times that of the average worker before the right-wing backlash took over Washington to an average of 1,000 times the average worker. Or an unregulated financial industry that led to a worldwide economic meltdown and an even greater polarization of human beings and nations into rich and poor. Or the turning of terrorism from a cause for global unity with a deep sense of empathy with what had happened to us to a deeper cause for global division, and so much more. And all of that happened because of the absence of a couple of thousand votes. Now, how dare anyone say that this is not the single most powerful thing we can do? And I hope also that those of us here, I know that we are, most folks here are probably activists, and I hope and believe that we understand that our social justice movements are all one movement. Sometimes our adversaries understand the links and connections better than we do. On campuses, sometimes kids will ask me, why is it that the same groups are against contraception and lesbians? But it makes sense, right? It makes sense because the inability of women to control their own reproduction and our own bodies has always been tied to the false notion that sexuality is only moral and okay if it's directed towards having children inside patriarchal marriage. And two women who love each other, two men who love each other, have always been punished for the same reason. They stand for a sexual expression that does not end in conception. We have been lied to systematically, all of us, about human sexuality, which has always been not just a way we have children if we choose to. I mean, from time immemorial, you know, the Native American women here totally understood contraception and abortifacients and had 3 or 4 children for 3 or 4 years. I mean, you know, we have always known that. And our sexual expression is a part of us, like our cerebral cortex, our reason, our ability to reason and remember. It's part of our humanity. I mean, all animals think, but only we think about thinking. You know, all animals feel, but only we, you know, feel about feeling. So it has always been a form of communication as well as a form of procreation. And we have been systematically lied to about that. So you always see that the movements of women trying to control their own physical selves and the movement for freedom of love and connection and reaching out and caring, regardless of how many X's and Y's we have, you know, has always come together. It's also true, it's even more, perhaps more obviously true, that the women's movement and the racial justice movements have always come together. You know, if you want to maintain racism, or that is some visible difference, you have to control reproduction. You have to make sure that the so-called superior women, whatever that means, are sexually isolated on a pedestal over here to be pure, quote unquote, and the so-called inferior women are not isolated but exploited in order to, so their bodies will produce more workers and soldiers. These two things have always gone together. We can see it in our own South, in the parallels. We can see it everywhere in the world. We can see, so there's just no such thing as being a feminist without being anti-racist. It just doesn't, it's not possible. And there's no such thing as trying to defeat racism without trying to free, first of all, the women who are half of the racially oppressed group, number one, and also all women who otherwise are oppressed as means of reproduction. And when it comes to the environment, I mean, the very same forces that withdrew a sense of godliness from women withdrew a sense of godliness from nature to make it okay to conquer women in nature. You know, all these things are intermeshed. And I just hope that we understand that, because sometimes our adversaries, you know, if you look at the groups that are so hostile and punitive towards undocumented immigrants, they are the same groups that are trying to suppress contraception, family planning, and so on, because they are in a panic that this country is about to become no longer majority European American, majority white, you know, in about 20 minutes, you know, it's not right. Which seems to me great. What's wrong with that? We're going to look more like the world. How great is that? You know, we're going to have more connection. But, you know, perhaps through no fault of theirs, they got born into structures that told them that there was a racial hierarchy, that there was a gender hierarchy in the home, that you had to have male-headed, you know, that there was masculinity over here and femininity over here, which is absolutely not true. People are people. There's more difference between two women or two men, and also more difference between two members of, say, between two Asian Americans and two Latinas than there is between Asians and Latinos. I mean, the individual difference is and always has been bigger than the group difference. So, but the good news is we now have a majority in this country. Look at all the public opinion polls. We have a majority that understands that these divisions make no sense, that doesn't anymore see this kind of hierarchy, that sees us as linked, not ranked. But we are not in enough of the positions of power. So what has happened is that the old authoritarian thinking folks, who again, you know, a lot of it is just what you get born into, and then it seems normal and so on, although we can get out of it, and we do. A lot of us here probably have progressed out of it, but for reasons, one reason or another, they haven't. And these forces took over the Republican Party. I always feel I have to apologize to all my friends who are real Republicans. Because, you know, the Republican Party was much better on race, as we know. I mean, the racist Southern Democrats were the problem, all during, you know, they were trying to get rid of Lincoln and, you know, all of that stuff. The Republican Party was also the first to support the Equal Rights Amendment, but once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, then the old think folks in the Democratic Party, Jesse Helms is always my big symbol of these, got angry and started gradually to move over and take over the Republican Party, and they have. And most of statistically, most of the people who are independents now used to be Republicans, but they have no more party. So, you know, this year, if we could not only win, but win big, it's possible that one of our two great parties would clean house. I mean, real Republicans might come back and take the place of the religious zealots and economic imperialists, you know, who have taken over the Republican Party. It's so dangerous to have one of our two big parties controlled by extremists, because people get naturally upset. Of course we're upset with some of the things the administration does, and then we just vote for the other party without understanding what we're voting for. We have to have big centrist parties with social justice movements influencing them and providing different kinds of alternatives. It's just too dangerous, this situation we have now. So I hope that on all these grounds, you will consider, I don't know, you know, you all know what's possible for you. I mean, just take 10 people with you to the polls. Make sure that people know it's quite simple, you know, just vote for all the judges and against 6 and all the other, right. Because it can look complicated because I think you have a very long ballot, right? Right. If you need information about individual candidates, I know that there's Ruth's List and Planned Parenthood and League of Women Voters, you know, to give you information. But this is it. This is it. There is no single thing on earth we can do that is more important than going into that ballot booth and voting for ourselves, for our full humanity, the humanity of the people we love, and also for what democracy, as somebody said, what do you think about democracy? And the answer was, well, it would be a good idea. For the democracy we could have once, because we are now finally beginning to see that the organizing principle of life is a circle, not a pyramid, that we are connected to nature, that we are connected to each other. The old idea of birth-based pyramids, which has only been around for less than 5% of human history, incidentally. It's really quite new in human history. That is beginning to dissipate as we come to know each other, as we understand that national boundaries are kind of meaningless, you know, when it comes to any polluted air or any poor people or any refugees, you know. It's interesting because I think we are going back in a new way toward the 95% of human history in which there were not lines drawn in the sand between nations. The globe was covered with migratory paths like lace. We intersected and traded and knew each other and had a very different idea about human divisions. I mean, in many of our Native American languages, and I think also for the Kwe and San in Africa, who were the oldest original people in Africa, there was no gender in the language. There was no he and she. There was no word for nature because we were part of nature, right? So sometimes I think we have a kind of cellular memory. We're kind of homesick, you know, for what once was. And what we need to do is act on it and not, absolutely not, be talked out of the idea that we have no power. We have the power. Thank you.